Hello, and welcome to Artificial Intelligence in Creative Industries and Practice, or as some of my colleagues have been calling it, AI Curious. Today, we are having a panel discussion with artists, journalists, researchers, lawyers, and people who cross one or more of those disciplines to talk about developments in artificial intelligence. My name is Sophie Pinkerton-Young, and I am the Manager of Digital Culture Initiatives at the Australia Council for the Arts. I would like to start off by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend those respects to the lands that you are coming in from today and any First Nations colleagues I have with me in the room. We're just going to start off this session with a quick one-liner about what Australia Council is doing in the digital space. And then we will cross to James Purtill, who is a technology journalist at the ABC, who will be our facilitator today and who will intro you to the rest of the panelists. As I mentioned before, I am the manager of the Digital Culture Initiatives, which means that I oversee the programs that sit under the Digital Culture Strategy, a strategy that was developed by Australia Council for the Arts and released in 2021. I do like to say that it was in development pre-COVID, but it was, really impacted by the developments that the whole sector made during that period of time. We have a series of programs that are part of the opportunities offered by this. And I'm just going to throw to Julie Ha, who is the producer, to just give you a quick one-liner of all of those programs.
Hello, everyone. So under the digital culture strategy, we have a few programs, including digital skills. The digital skills programs is a series of workshops, seminars, and intensives that focus on using digital and emerging technologies to develop creative practice. Including this seminar right here. There's also the Acme Symposium next week, which is also a part of this program. We also have the Digital Strategist in Residence program, which is a program that provides arts organizations with access to a specialist who will organize to develop and or enable a digital strategy. That program just kicked off last week. It's really exciting in its 5th cohort. And we also have the Digital Transformations for Creative Industries, which is a partnership with UTS, a 6-week online short course, which provides insight into digital strategy and new technologies for small to medium organizations. And our other program is the Digital Fellowship Program, which is in partnership with Creative New Zealand. And it brings together artists to explore and develop their digital practices from Australia and New Zealand.
Thank you so much for that, Julie. Now, that is enough from us because I know that everyone has come here today to hear from our panelists talk about all of these very exciting developments that are happening in AI. So I'm going to pass over to James now, who's going to just give you a quick overview and then talk us through our panelists and what we're going to talk about.
Thank you, Sophie, and welcome everyone to the panel discussion. My name is James. I'm the tech reporter for the ABC Specialist Science team. And to start off, before we get to the panel discussion, I'd like to give a quick introduction to the topic. We'll only go for 5 minutes. So 2022 was the breakout year for AI, and it's the reason we're here today with record turnout and lots of questions. I'll come back to 2022 in a minute, but first, let's look at how we actually got here. Personally, I grew up seeing AI in books and movies, and I had the vague idea that when I was older, it would be invented. But as I got older, it sort of receded into the future. It was always 20 years away. We were told that AI would change the way we live, but it was really too abstract to care about. Then, about 6 years ago, in 2017, a team of engineers at Google invented a new AI model called Transformer. And I only mention that name because it's the T in GPT, as in ChatGPT. And Transformer is like a supercharged predict text, on your phone. It's an algorithm that predicts what comes next in a sentence, and it's trained on huge amounts of data. All the journals and books and articles and Reddit conversations, everything that we've digitized, it's trained on. And it turned out it could write. 2018, GPT-1 was released, 2019, GPT-2, 2020, GPT-3. And that's when I sort of tried it for the first time. And when I saw whole sentences scrolling across the page of machine-authored prose, I felt a sense of wonder. This was a machine doing something that I considered to be exclusively human, writing. You know, most of the time technology is annoying and frustrating and clumsy, but sometimes it can feel miraculous. That was 2020, and these models were bubbling around in the background. People in the industry were getting excited, but AI hadn't really broken through. For most people, it was still something in the future. 2022 was different. And probably what changed was text-to-image generators became much better, much more available, much more commonly used. We had Mid-Journey, Stable Diffusion, DALL-E 2 released. And, you know, we saw people posting these images on social media. It became kind of this fun, memeable thing. And then at the end of the year, the kind of icing on the cake, ChatGPT was released. Basically, it was GPT-3, which was 2 years old by that point, with a slight upgrade and a chat interface. The technology wasn't that much better, but it passed some kind of invisible popular threshold, and AI suddenly became accepted as this real thing. It was finally here after years of waiting. And there were emotional reactions to this. There was fear, disdain, contempt, also excitement and awe. We saw Nick Cave calling the AI's Nick Cave style lyrics a grotesque mockery of being human. But also I spoke with others like architects and authors and visual artists who talked about how they were using these new AI as useful ways to spark ideas and explore their imaginations. So I'm coming at this from a very open-minded perspective. As Sophie would say, I'm AI curious. I'm kind of open-minded to the point of fence sitting here. I'm very invested. I work in journalism and I love to write. And AI's ability actually makes me quite uncomfortable sometimes. I have this nagging sense that it devalues writing in general. And sometimes I marvel at what it can create. And other times I'm reminded that although it's very impressive, it's also very dumb. And that's a dangerous combination. It just makes up facts, it makes it up. And it sounds convincing. It doesn't actually understand anything. It has no common sense. What appears to be a conversation is just prediction. It's just remixing human authored sentences. And on top of that, it's owned by enormous corporations, and it's trained on publicly available data that was arguably sourced unethically. It's ripping off artists. So I've come here to learn from our excellent panel, assembled by the Australia Council. We'll have 1 hour of panel chat and then 30 minutes of questions from the audience. So to introduce the panel, I'll go one by one. Xanthe Dobbie is an Australian artist and filmmaker working across on and offline modes of making. Their practice aims to capture the experience of contemporaneity as reflected through queer and feminist ideologies. Kathryn Gledhill-Tucker is a Nyungar technologist, writer, digital rights activist, currently living on Wajak Nyungar Budja. She explores the intersection of activism, science fiction, and technology in imagining radical futures. Dr. Nina Rajcic. Nina is an interdisciplinary artist, researcher, and developer exploring new possibilities of human-machine relationships. Her recent work draws inspiration from the link between language and the self, exploring the role of narrative in the synthesizing of meaning and the construction of identity. And Benjamin Duff. Ben is a commercial and intellectual property lawyer at Maddox with an avid interest in AI and how it is changing the intellectual property landscape. Ben is involved in the provision of legal advice on a range of commercial issues, including copyright, trademarks, IT, information and communications, technology contracting, to a range of Australian government and private clients. I'm sure people will have a lot of questions about copyright for Ben. So just to get the ball rolling, Xanthe, I'm kind of interested in the way that you approach AI and how you might be already using AI in your work.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you all for having me. I'm tuning in today from unceded Wurundjeri country down here in Naarm. AI is such an interesting one, James, and I think that I too would classify myself in the AI curious sexuality group of this phenomenon. I, in my practice, use a bunch of different technologies, and I tend to just jump on whatever is happening at the time to get a bit of a lay of the land. So historically, that's been everything from virtual reality to augmented reality to just random generators on the internet and figuring out how to smash them all together. And as you said, 2022 was very much the year for AI to become this sort of prolific mainstream thing. So naturally, I had to have a go at that, somewhat more successfully than the last time I tried to jump on a trend, which was NFTs. So in my work, I collaborate with AI, I suppose. I think that the art that AI makes, specifically the image art, is incredibly banal, but it can be a really interesting starting point for creative practice. And I think that the writing stuff like ChatGPT is phenomenal. While you were speaking, I just wrote down a little list of programs that I've used in the last year across various works. I most recently attempted to train ChatGPT to write a chapter of my PhD thesis. It was not successful, but why not? But I've also used Copy AI, Writer, various text-to-image generators, DALL-E and DALL-E 2, got really obsessed with vocodes, which is now Fake You. I created a series of works across 2021 and 2022 that are, they're all narrated by AI generators. There's one work, The Long Now, that's still up at Acme online, I think in Gallery 5, which is narrated by a resurrected AI version of Alan Rickman. And my work that I did for the Sydney Opera House shortwave program in 2021 was narrated by David Attenborough. So, you know, can really cut budget costs with this stuff.
It sounds like you're very open to using it, and I'd love to hear in a little bit how you sort of how your students have been using it as well. But
yeah,
Nina, you know, I mentioned before Nick Cave and his sweeping criticism of the AI song lyrics. I'm interested, you know, in your take on that. Your own work looks at AI in maybe a more nuanced way. It's sort of exploring the ability to connect with AI. So I wonder what you made of Nick Cave's disdain.
Yeah, I mean, I am a fan of Nick Cave, so I definitely biased his opinion. I really do value what he wrote. Like, I think it's quite a nice takedown of AI and GPT, I guess, especially. But yeah, I think that he kind of brought up that idea of like anything kind of generated by an AI system kind of falls under this idea of like burlesque, which I thought was really interesting. Basically, that it's just kind of like replicating or caricaturing like human art. And I really do agree with that. I think it's kind of hard to imagine this kind of GPT or stable diffusion algorithm coming up with anything truly new. It really just spits out like an amalgamation of what it's seen in the data set, like what it's been trained on. And of course, that kind of brings like a number of legislative ethical concerns, which I'm sure others have more to say on that. But yeah, I think maybe like reflecting on that article, I think what's maybe problematic about that conception of AI is that we're kind of trying to imagine these algorithms as artists or creators like in themselves, like basically like an independent system that's supposed to kind of have some intention. And when you view it like that, I think obviously the output is going to be meaningless. It's going to be a meaningless caricature because there's nothing really behind what it's outputting. Just like Nick Cave said, there's no kind of story of suffering, there's no overcoming something or triumph, or there's no kind of like struggle of creation. But yeah, the way I've been using it in my work really is more of seeing the technology as an extension of humans and human creativity, and basically just another tool that we can use in creative practice. But yeah, I mean, maybe we can talk about this a bit further, but I think as long as they don't have self-awareness or intention or like sentience or general AI or whatever, I don't really think that the output will ever kind of like compete with human creativity.
Yeah, maybe we can get to that later, kind of looking at the way that these AI might change ideas of creativity and kind of machine augmented creativity. But you mentioned some of the ethical concerns there. Kathryn, I'm interested in what you say about some of the ethical concerns raised by both developing these AI and using them. And I'll just, quick anecdote. I was chatting to a school the other day, and they said one of their main concerns with ChatGPT wasn't students cheating, but data privacy, which I was surprised by. They said, what happens to the prompts that students enter into the bot? So yeah, can you walk us through some of the ethical issues raised here?
Sure, yeah, and we've brought up a couple of concerns already. I think I love again what you've said about this kind of like burlesque experience of artificial intelligence made me think of like robots cosplaying as humans or laughing as humans, which is a framing that I'd never thought of before. So thank you, Nina. But yeah, so data privacy, we've talked, I think, James, you've already touched on a couple of concerns already. So I guess like large language models require lots of data. They're pretty voracious beings. More data means a greater training set. And platforms like ChatGPT are using publicly available data across the internet, but publicly available, as you say, doesn't always mean ethically sourced. And arguably none of it is ethically sourced because no one has consented to feeding their data or information into these machines. So data can be proprietary or copyrighted as well. And I know we've got an IP specialist on the panel, so I won't go into too much about that. But it can also contain culturally sensitive information. And this is where we come into questions about Indigenous sovereignty and cultural protocols around knowledge sharing that a machine is not programmed to understand unless we teach it these protocols. And certainly the companies building these platforms are not interested in baking into the foundations of these artificial intelligence machines. So I would always encourage people to read terms and conditions when we're using platforms like this, but even then, that's very rarely an accessible, reasonable expectation to ask from people. How many times have we read through the terms and conditions of anything that we use? There are, dozens of tools and applications that we use in our day-to-day life. It's just not feasible. But I would presume that even when you do retain the ownership over the output of whatever prompts you provide to ChatGPT, which is what has been suggested in the privacy policy of this particular platform, the company can still use your inputs to further train the model. So you're essentially contributing new information to the database. So I would just presume that you're relinquishing power and relinquishing control over what information that you are giving to these platforms, unless you're very careful or very cautious or very confident that you're using, an offline or open source model or something that isn't connected to the cloud, which is unlikely. So yeah, I don't put anything into it that could be commercially sensitive or confidential, or that you wouldn't be comfortable handing over to a stranger. And that is particularly concerning when we're thinking about children or people who haven't consented to giving up their information, or maybe don't understand the consequences of relinquishing this kind of data and this kind of privacy, or are too young to even technically or legally consent to that kind of data sharing.
Yeah, that topic of unethical sourcing of data, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts later on, what a visual artist can do to prevent their art being used to train future AI models. But just to go to Ben for a moment, I know there's already questions about copyright, and it's a huge and murky and complicated topic. Just to sketch it out, if I ask a generative AI to produce an image in the style of a certain artist, is it the artist who made the images that the AI was trained upon who has the copyright? Is it the maker of the AI program, or is it me who wrote the prompts? or was it some strange combination of all of those? Kind of what's the state of the law there right now, and how are legal systems around the world approaching this issue?
Yeah, thanks, James. So as you kind of already alluded to, it's really going to depend. I think the area we can most kind of work through an answer is probably putting aside the question of what it's been trained on, or whether or not the person who created the AI tool can actually claim some sort of ownership of the output, and more look at what happens when you enter in your prompt and something gets generated. And usually what we do when we do this kind of stuff is we look at, there's a test we run through where we ask questions like, first of all, what is the type of work? Is it something that's covered by the Copyright Act? And given we're talking about maybe an image generator or ChatGPT, we're normally going to lean to them being literary or artistic works that do attract copyright. There's a bit of a question of whether or not, because there's no human involvement at that point, does it even go that far? But that's not, this is just to say it's still a bit unclear there. Once we know we're talking about a actual work, we then look at whether or not it's original. And this is where a lot of this is going to come down to. I think, Xanthe, you said that AI generation is fairly banal, and the courts have actually recognized that there needs to be a level of independent intellectual effort that does occur when you are working with electronic tools. So putting something in and just getting whatever spit out and then claiming ownership over it might not reach that threshold, that intellectual effort. Once we kind of have that, so it'll really turn on kind of the nature of the work and how you're going about producing it. We then move to whether or not there's a human author behind it. That's the next kind of step. And normally then we've also got case law that tells us that normally this requires some sort of manual input by the human, and it can't just be like just dragging files or something like that. There needs to be some sort of shaping or directing of the material by humans. And that kind of, once we have those two things, if you can demonstrate those two things, you kind of then can say, hey, look, this is probably something that has copyright in it. But then we come to that final step, which is whatever the terms say in the actual tool that you're using. It is open for people to contractually agree to various different things, including that they've given the IP of something that they've created away. And I think it's that's always going to be that last step that you need to check. And it can also sometimes help in working out what other people think. So Night Cafe, for example, doesn't actually say you're going to own, that there's any intellectual property in whatever it produces. It says, hey, this is a really complex area of law. If there is intellectual property, you can have it once it's generated, but you don't own anything that goes into making it or anything else like that, but you do get that final output. So that's kind of a rough area of where we go to get that kind of answer. But then that's all factored in with what it was trained on. If you're telling it to, rip off Nick Cave, for example, then maybe there's other questions there. And I mean, there's an open question as to whether or not all of this is actually just the AI, the person who created this AI tool actually owns everything that comes out of it, because it's all just an extension of that tool. And that's the actual artwork, for lack of a better word there, or the actual work.
So the AI model itself is the artwork?
Yeah, and everything that created of it is just an extension, but that's probably unlikely to flow fully. But it is another way to look at it as well. So it's a really complex area, so there's no clear answer.
Well, I'd love to sort of hear your thoughts later on, when we might get some clarity here, and what sort of cases are.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I know the Australian government is currently open to submissions on the Copyright Act and whether or not it's working as intended. And I think until March, it's open for people to put in their thoughts and ideas. So we might see a bit of movement in this tech space, because Australia has to date kind of been a bit reluctant in accepting some of the evolution of technology that other places have accepted. So
I find that quite a confronting idea, that the AI model itself could be the artwork, and we're sort of just kind of tentacles of the octopus. So Xanthe, I'm curious about how your students are using AI, because I imagine that might be a bit of an insight into how it might be used in the future.
Yes, I've just been taking down so many notes as we go through this conversation. But yes, I taught a class last semester at RMIT, where I'm doing my PhD and where I teach, and it was on the sort of, it was practice-based subject, loosely about the trajectory of cyberfeminism and cyborg theory, all the way up to Legacy Russell's glitch feminism, which came out in 2020. And each week I was setting different tasks just about looking at different technologies and how we can use them and embrace them as different mediums. And of course, I had to cover AI because it was so hot at the time. But I found that, as Ben was just saying, that the students were not able to create art with it. Like, they got so wrapped up in the idea of being able to just like put a text prompt into a form and get an image back. And it was like, they weren't able to push past that step. And as I was saying in my haphazard introduction to my practice, I find those images really banal. And I think that there is a version of art where you can really embrace these tools and create something that, as Ben was pointing to, has a human artistic voice. I'm not really opposed to being a tentacle of the AI octopus. I think that that's kind of amazing, like that AR is just like this meta performance artist that will eventually overthrow us. That's hilarious and devastating, but you know, we've come to a very existential place these last few years. But the students, anyway, hopefully I can push them a little bit further this year across various schools that I am going to be inflicting myself upon. I do think that, as an example of a practice that I think is really successful in this area, is somebody like Holly Herndon that takes AI images and then creates these sort of incredible psychedelic transformative animations from them. In my own practice, where I suppose I think I've been successful, I have predominantly used text-based stuff. I mean, I've used a bit of everything, but I think that I've enjoyed the collaborative aspects of using ChatGPT, or I actually like the clunkier ones. I love Copy AI because it's so weird. Like, the stuff that it throws back at you as marketing copy is insane. I recently wrote a collaborative eulogy to the edition of Runway Journal that I am currently guest editing. And I was trying to create a base script for my video performance work thing that is the editor's letter, but is actually a eulogy to the edition, which is themed Ghost. And I probably generated about 10,000 words in that process. I had to go through 2 free trials to get that many words out of it. And then from those 10,000 words, condensed it down into like a 400-word script. So it became more of a collage process that then, which was closer to writing, and writing something unique would have been much, much faster. But I really wanted to have the voice of the machine. I love a little cyborg moment.
Nina, I wonder if you have anything to add there. I mean, with the use of the word collage, kind of asks the question, or, you know, people in the chat have been saying it's similar to using a camera. Is there anything analogous here, you know, historically analogous to what we're going through right now?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm sure everyone's kind of picked up on that. Like, this is happening again, where there's a new technology and everyone's freaking out, but that happened when cameras were invented and they thought it would replace painting. Like, I think that kind of argument has kind of come through, and people maybe are realizing that it, I hope anyway, this is the way I feel about it, that it is just another technology. There is, like, obviously more complicated things going on with, like, ethically and also how it's affecting kind of like, you know, like physical artistic practices, let's just say. But I think that analogy does work quite well. And I think when you see it like through that metaphor, then, and you're talking about kind of like art, creating art through it and creative practice, the way I kind of like to see it, or the most hopeful kind of vision I have, is treating the AI, let's just say Stable Diffusion, or DALL-E or any of the image generators, as a medium in itself. And I think, you kind of view it as a medium, then it's not so much kind of like if you just create something, one thing with this medium, then that kind of constitutes it to be art. But like if you take one photo, it's not necessarily a piece of art, but you can create art with that medium if you kind of follow. I mean, I guess this is more of like an art theory, art history conversation, but things like pushing that medium to its limits or subverting the medium. I think that's all like really interesting ways you can, I don't know, I guess go forward and use it creatively, which is kind of what I've tried to do. And I think when Xanthe was saying you like to use like the worst version of GPT or like the copy version of GPT. Yeah, I think I relate to that. I think it's kind of similar with the diffusion models, where it's almost more interesting to me when they're a bit wrong, like when the output's a bit like the fact that you can't generate correct looking hands, or they always have like the wrong amount of fingers on them. Or my personal favorite is when you try to generate any kind of text, it's basically looks kind of visually like it's text, but it is just meaningless. And so for some reason, the model was never actually able to learn a language when it was being trained on those billions or however many images. So I think kind of going in that direction where you're basically finding the errors of the medium and then exploiting them and basically finding something interesting in them. I think that's probably like the way forward in terms of AI art for me anyway.
Yeah, so you don't see any maybe inherent distinction between art that's made with contribution from AI and art that sort of entirely has nothing to do with AI.
I think, are you saying that, is there a difference?
Yeah, do you see any difference there?
I think there is definitely a difference. It's just, I think that's also a super complex problem that I'm also trying to figure out at the moment. Like there must be, I think there is, we are entering into kind of a new era, like there was something more there. I think the AI has more agency, if we want to think of it like that, than maybe just a camera. I think there's a lot of complex issues there. So I think it is different, but in a way it's a useful metaphor when you're talking about creating art or creative practice.
It reminds me of that, and Ben, you would know about this better than I do, but that copyright case a few years ago when the monkey took the photo and it was questioned.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah. It's interesting. Not necessarily a monkey taking a photo. I don't think an AI is quite a monkey taking a photo. But I think someone mentioned photographs before and that kind of stuff, and it's useful to recognize that the Copyright Act explicitly calls out these things like photographs and cinematographic films and stuff, and gives them specific provisions. And that's not, and maybe that's where the step where we need to go next with AI generated material is to recognize it as a separate form of work, and that gives a bit more flexibility to recognize maybe more the ephemeral nature of the copy of the work itself, because they're pretty fast and punchy. I don't see someone wanting to keep their AI art for, maybe I'm wrong, for 70 odd years or something like that. Maybe someone else has a different view on that. But I think maybe that's the way we're probably heading in there. And I can already see it. Well, we've seen other countries grapple with the same issue, and most are not at the point where they're willing to recognize AI art produced itself. So the US has denied it at the Copyright Council. Italy is starting to make moves towards it, but it's still very early stages. So I think that's where we're at. And I think it's just going to be a legislative change.
Yeah, I was going to ask, is this something Australia could legislate on to give clarity, even though the AI models are made overseas and based overseas? Could we legislate just to say, look, this is where copyright falls? Yeah,
we could for Australia. It would then be a question of whether or not that's recognized anywhere else. So I guess a broader picture to recognize is internationally, we have several large agreements that deal with intellectual property and how each country handles intellectual property kind of as a standard, because obviously each country can kind of make up their own laws and set their own laws in relation to IP and other bits and pieces. And so we need to have that standard here. So for example, Australia recognises, despite our Copyright Act saying an author of copyright needs to be an Australian citizen, we also recognise that citizens of other countries can also generate copyright and they'll be treated like Australian citizens for the purposes of that act. So even if we start in Australia, it might not have the global impact that we want, but it's something that'll need to be dealt with kind of at a global level, really, given how we're all connected now in any event.
Kathryn, can you see any role here for legislation as well?
Yeah, and it's tricky because I think it's a common thing to say. Technology moves faster than legislative reform. I don't think that's a controversial thing to say, Ben. So I do feel like we're constantly playing catch up, both in terms of copyright law and privacy reform as too. So I don't know what a world looks like where we can have legislation that is more technology agnostic and we can kind of keep up regardless, because as soon as we legislate for AI tools and platforms like ChatGPT, a new thing will come up and then we'll have to figure out how to legislate for that as well. Yeah, it is a tricky thing to balance, I suppose, like local legislation and regulation and global regulation when we're working with global platforms and local artists and local users. But yes, Ben, you mentioned the Copyright Act is under review and people are able to make submissions. I just wanted to touch on that a little bit because it can be a little bit daunting to write submissions, but I encourage everyone to. You don't need to be an expert. A submission can be really short and you can just speak to what's important to you about copyright or about art. So if that is something that people are interested in doing, I highly recommend. It can be a page long. It can be, I'm an artist, my name is, and this is how copyright affects my life, and this is how I'd like it to be different. So yes. And
before I was wondering if people can do anything to prevent their own images being used to train an AI. I want to put you on the spot a bit there, but is there anything apart from not uploading them to the internet?
Yeah, and it is a bit of a tricky thing to encourage, I suppose, like individual action and responsibility for things that are very systemic, and there are powers that are much bigger than an individual artist or an individual user. So maybe I'll separate them a little bit. Yes, you can take all of your images down and not put them on the internet and not make them scrapable or shareable. I know, and maybe the other artists on the panel can speak to this a little bit better, but I know that there was a big conversation around deviant art and artists being able to opt out of their images on that platform being used to train models. But a lot of it is about movement pressure too, and the kind of activism that comes with putting pressure on not just platforms, but also legislation to determine, and I have a bit of a say around what is acceptable and what feels ethical and what kind of changes we want to demand from both government legislation and also commercial platforms.
Just to jump in there as well, I think it's really interesting because so far we've not seen kind of a uniform approach. So there's this issue going on of art being taken from the internet and being used to train these AIs. And you've gotten a wildly different set of things. ArtStation hasn't really chosen to do much. But then you've got people like, I think, is it Getty Images has now set up a separate fund, which it's using to pay for people who've uploaded it to kind of acknowledge that that's kind of been going on. And you're getting a whole gamut of different reactions. And I think it's a bit of a difficult issue as well, because how else is an artist supposed to showcase their work without the internet? And maybe it's a case of just finding the ones that appeal to you and make sure you don't go to, say, the art stations if you ever don't want them stealing or taking things.
Yeah, and right now we're in this sort of interim period where a lot of the AI models are actually free to use because they're all on trial and so on. So you kind of get this flow of AIs being trained on artists' images, but it's also the artists can use the AI output for free. I imagine that's going to change pretty quickly as the technology matures. Xanthe, I mean, how would that affect your work if you have to start paying potentially kind of corporate rates for for the use of these models?
I'm not paying for anything. I don't pay for anything in my work. Like AI is one thing, but every aspect of my work is stolen. Like what I do is direct elements together. Like I sort of work within an expanded collage space. So I'm always coming up against copyright stuff, and the Australian legal system is really all over the place. I seem to be kind of fine when I'm in a museum or an art gallery context. And then when I work in theatre spaces, they freak out. If I'm in film, then we have to pay for shit. It's like nobody really has a go-to on how any of this works. And AI will be no different for me. I will just infinitely create email addresses and do free trials into the ether. I already have like 20 of them. I only just started paying for iCloud storage, not iCloud, Google Drive. And it took a lot to sacrifice that $2 a month. But I just started forgetting my passwords, so it had to happen.
I mean, so it sounds like what you're saying is artists will just kind of get around it. And
artists will get around it. I think that what I kept thinking of within this conversation, and I've been watching this chat as it develops as well and looked at some of the Q&A things, I think of artists like Soda Jerk who just, you know, prolifically use other people's work in their work, and that's the point. Like the whole point is that you know that it's a reference, as it is with AI. I think that the reason that I find these AI generated images banal is because you just like, okay, well, that's a robot image, who cares? Like putting it within context is the thing that gives it a meaning, which is true for any source material or any collage practice or any remix or anything that's going to be produced by AI ongoing. And artists are pirates. We'll find a way.
Yeah, and Nina, I mean, for me, I wonder if when you have to pay a hefty monthly subscription for the use of an AI model, I wonder if that would, even though artists are pirates, whether that would change attitudes towards this technology, because it seems to me like quite unfair that an AI trained for free, or not for free, but on freely sourced images is now outputting images at a cost.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll eat my words on this, but I mean, up until now, the kind of programming, dev, computer science, GitHub community has always come through. Like there is, I guess you would say that the most money is in kind of that private industry. And yeah, they're probably leading the advancements. So they might have like the biggest models, or they have the most money for training, or whatever it might be, but there is always somebody working on it and trying to make it open source. And that's what it's been like up until now. I know OpenAI was great for a while. Like when they first released GPT-1 and 2, it was just like, you can download the model. And I guess the thing that needs to be democratized is the ability to actually code and like use these models without necessarily having a kind of interface that is more user-friendly. So I think that accessibility part, and also, you know, having access to a GPU is a big step still for a lot of like artists and just people who want to experiment. But I think, you know, if you're in that space of the more kind of programming GitHub, it should, I hope, always be accessible. I don't think they could really kind of block that from us. But I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm envisioning too much of a utopian. This is how it's been going anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, on that topic of utopias, we've sort of got about 15 minutes left in the panel discussion. And I thought it might be cool to kind of go around the panel and sketch out scenarios for what could come next. You know, for example, why copyright is important and what happens if you don't resolve these copyright issues. Or you do, but you resolve it the wrong way. Or yeah, some of the ethical issues raised and so on. Maybe Ben, to start off with, why is that? I suppose the question really is, why is copyright important? Like, are there cases where copyright is left murky for too long and it creates lots of confusion, or it's decided the wrong way and there's kind of flow-on effects?
I think it always depends on where you're coming from. And I think what's really interesting, especially in this AI and the tech space and AI space in particular, in those areas and GitHubs and stuff, is there is a weird fusion of private corporate interests, a lot of big proponents of open source or copyleft licensing, and then artist communities as well. And they've all got very different interests in how they'd like to see an intellectual property regime kind of land. I mean, you've got anything from everybody should be free to use whatever creative outputs and share and remix and do whatever you want, all the way to they should all be locked down as tight as possible for as long as possible so I can continue to make a return on my investment. And I think that's kind of why you need a heading, is you need some sort of Copyright Act that sets the bounds of this, kind of saying this is what we've decided is appropriate. Right now, we've kind of recognized these private interests up to a point, be it for artistic works, life of the author plus 70 years, give or take, depending on which part of Copyright Act you fall under. But also recognizing things like there are times where it's fair to use something or it's a fair dealing to use it, or recognizing interests of librarians and museums and other bits and pieces, and making sure it's still captured under the same umbrella, kind of make sure everybody understands that we're all operating on the same kind of framework. But what that framework looks like, I can't really begin to understand. But I think that's probably why. So everybody has a shared kind of response pattern is probably the best reason for it.
And just quickly, it sounds like we're still a long way from getting any clarity here. 5 years? I don't know.
It would really depend on, I think the first step is whatever comes out of this review of the Copyright Act, and that might give an indication as to where sentiment is and to where the government thinks that they could head to next, or what they suggest next. I'm sure there's other larger organizations, international organizations, that are also making similar submissions or calls, but I'm not aware of anything at the moment.
Just a reminder to get your submissions in there. Kathryn, I'm interested in your kind of dystopian and utopian visions here for how it might work out. Let's start off with the bad vision.
I think we have plenty of dystopian visions, and it's fascinating because I think a lot of tech companies and tech founders and CEOs look at dystopic fiction as blueprints rather than warning signs. So I think we have plenty of dystopian visions. We have Snow Crash, we have William Gibson, and Zuckerberg's kind of looked at all of it and been like, yes, that's what I want, rather than like, this is this horrific future that could happen if we're not careful. In terms of utopia, I do often think wistfully about the Berners-Lee vision of the free and open web, and I think that does contribute part of my utopia: free and open access to hardware and software and network to whoever wants to have access to it. And I do extend that to models like ChatGPT and even like models like Stable Diffusion as tools that are interesting and might be able to inform our practice. I think that exists alongside rules and protocols that determine how we want our data and our art to be shared. I think that is up to the individual to be able to enforce that kind of agency and autonomy over, here's something that I've made and here's exactly how I want it to be shared, rather than those rules and protocols being dictated by multinational corporations. That's my utopia. And
Xanthe, your attitude once seems to be one of kind of gleeful experimentation. Is that how you imagine the next, the future rolling out?
I mean, the future is a difficult thing to imagine at this time. I think that I, like Kathryn, sort of enjoy writing this utopia dystopia dichotomy, and all sci-fi ever, as Kathryn has said, has been leading up to this point. We've arrived, the future is now. We don't really know what the next thing is. We don't have any mythologies around that yet, which is as exciting as it is terrifying. You know, we're at a real what is the meaning of life moment where we have fully arrived at this like cyborgian interlocking of experience. And, you know, technology is technology. We're the people that are going to screw it up. And we'll see what happens. Like, we're in a really strange, pendulous time sociopolitically. We have this sort of neoliberal hellscape emerging where Meta essentially owns the world. You know, Jeff Bezos is as rich as like 4 countries combined. To think that we have any power at this point is just absurd. We'll just see what happens with all of this data, and you know, it's a bit exciting. I don't know if it's like a millennial or a Gen Z thing to be like, well, if the world's gonna end, I'd prefer to see it.
Yeah, I think there is that mood to it all. On that topic of sci-fi, you know, it sort of feels like science fiction without AI at this point feels as dated as science fiction without mobile phones. It sort of there's like a kind of fork in the road. We've gone down that way. Nina, how do you see the future?
I think I do have this really like hopeful vision that maybe could happen, which is basically, I guess, seeing the kind of stable diffusion DALL-E as like, I think the reason there's so much funding behind it is kind of purely not so much for like art or creative people or whatever, but mainly for like content creation and like social media. It's like a really easy way to just get like low cost, you don't have to hire someone. So basically, if we kind of carry on in this direction, we'll see, you know, like 100% of what we scroll through on our feed being AI generated, right? And then maybe that will eventually just become so meaningless and just detached from reality or something that it might take down, it might just fully take down social media in some way, and we'll all just be like, this is completely pointless. Let's kind of return to physical practice, like working with materials again, the real, I don't know, this is probably too hopeful, but that's kind of how I feel already.
Yeah, I can see kind of AI already nibbling at the edges of my industry. Like, I use it every day to transcribe interviews, and in the kind of content system that we have for posting on the internet, there's already talk about automating some of the metadata and things like that. In some other newsrooms, there's sports and business journalists have been replaced by AI. So yeah, I'm excited if it means that I'd have to do less drudge work, but yeah, worried if I won't have a job at all at the end of it. It might be time to go to some questions from the audience, and we have heaps. Thank you, Sophie, for sending a couple through. One of them is, I was wondering about the privilege to access all this technology for creating art. Additionally, the digital literacy that people will require for appreciating this sort of art. That might be a question for Xanthe there. Do you have any thoughts on, it requires a certain kind of skill set to be able to both use these new AI tools, but also to appreciate the art that's created by them?
Well, I mean, I think that that's a broader question of privilege and access across all art and education and pretty much every other aspect of life in colonial so-called Australia. But yeah, absolutely. Like we sort of have arrived at a point that will become alienating intergenerationally. In the other direction, though, I certainly in my own practice and in the way that I teach my students and wherever else, as I said, I don't have any interest in the paid versions of these tools. There is a lot of open access software out there. Most of the stuff that I use is apps on my phone. So yes, there is a threshold there, which is you have to have a level of access to technology. Technically, I suppose everybody kind of does with public libraries and facilities and all of those sorts of things. You know, tech literacy is available to you at your local Apple store if you want to go. But yeah, privilege is an issue everywhere, is my answer to that question. And this is no exception.
Nina, on that topic of sort of intergenerational alienation, I wonder, you know, I think that probably is a little bit of what's happening here. Have you observed that with work that both involves AI, or, you know, work that, or people wanting to create AI work, or kind of understanding what the AI work is trying to say?
Yeah, definitely seen a lot of mixed kind of levels of understanding, I guess, of the technology behind it. And I think, I mean, not so, maybe because it's so new, it really is just the last 4 years or something. It wasn't so much generational, but you know, majority of people didn't really, like when I was kind of exhibiting my works in the past, don't really have a good kind of base knowledge of how powerful the system actually is, or how much does it actually know, what is it actually aware of. So there's a little bit of just kind of maybe a bit of mysticism around that term. And I'm sure, because it is so new to all of us, I'm sure kind of as we kind of grow older, I mean, I already feel it with myself, so many things like TikTok or whatever, but there will be some kind of gap where it just becomes really hard to grasp exactly what this is. And hopefully, I mean, the newer generations will be able to handle it.
This one might be for Kathryn. It's a question around, you know, this how the databases that the AI was trained upon are kind of skewed. The question is, how, you know, based on the contents that are already out there, which are predominantly hetero, white, male, first world, non-inclusives, I'm wondering why you would want to source from this data sets unless you are producing satire.
That's such a good question. And that's exactly right. Like, I think there's a tendency to think of AI, because they're machines, because they're technology, as unbiased, kind of like rational actors, but they, especially natural language processing and large language models, they're going to be as biased as the data that we put into them. And we need to be very mindful of that when we're assessing any of its output. So you're exactly right. It's going to be as white, as colonial, as capitalist as the underlying data set that is being fed into it. And that's going to be replicated when it's output. It's not going to be this unbiased output. I know we're talking about creative practices in AI, and we're talking about art, and not to say that biased output is less unethical, but these models are often trained for the purpose of surveillance and policing. And I think we need to be very responsible for the way these models are built, the way these platforms are developed and deployed, because of the kind of worst case scenarios of what happens to that biased output, which is perpetuating a system where people are overpoliced and incarcerated.
Yeah, so your point there is like computer vision models, methods of facial recognition, of mapping images. You know, one application of that is surveillance.
Yeah, facial recognition, and also like predictive policing has been coming up again in conversation and should immediately be thrown in the bin. But it's all part of one ecosystem, I suppose, of large language models and artificial intelligence. They're being trained for various applications, but they don't exist in discrete buckets. We don't have like our art and creative practices over here and surveillance and incarceration over here. They're all kind of feeding into one another. There's
a question here. Well, it's really a question around jobs and AI, particularly in graphic design, and a bit of anecdote. I don't think AI can ever replace humans in making what we call art, but I do have very real concerns as a creative industry student and soon to be graduate about companies using AI tools to create digital content instead of paying a human to do that. How does the industry keep digital creatives and creative industries workers from being skipped over by AI tools to create simple content? Tools like ChatGPT can already do decent web design and is getting better at writing articles and other content. I can confirm that's the case. I am concerned that creative industry workers will not be able to find paid gigs with the rise of AI. That might be one for Xanthe or Nina. Do either of you have any thoughts on what this means for young graphic artists who are graduating right now, for example?
Yeah, I definitely think that it's a foreboding moment for many different professions, but I think that this same conversation is very easy to translate over onto things like gig economy and Uber and the sort of crisis that we've been having with apps running the world already. Eugenia Lim has a really good artwork about this, actually. Can't remember what it's called, but it's all about gig economy and sort of the giving our souls and lives to the robots and the apps, essentially. I don't know what's going to happen, but learn to code. I feel like coding is going to be one of the safe guys.
Yeah,
ChatGPT can now write code, so maybe that's over too. Get person skills, like bake bread. I have no skills for the apocalypse, like pretty much just leadership at this point.
Just to jump in as well. Oh, sorry, Nina, you go ahead.
Just a quick thing is that we've done a little bit of research at our lab, a few workshops just with art, like getting artists to basically work with this kind of technology. We were doing specifically with music, AI generated music, and musicians working with that, and kind of just a workshop discussing whether they would want something like this. And something that came out of that, which I thought was interesting, was a lot of artists didn't really mind the idea that you could use this technology to kind of replace some of the brunt work, like some of the work where you're like paid jobs where you're not necessarily like, I guess it's a problem when the companies themselves are outsourcing, but maybe I don't know how it would be structured, but the fact that you wouldn't necessarily have to do that work for paid jobs, and you could actually like focus more so on the actual creative pursuit that you're working on. So maybe that's a way to kind of separating content from art, I think, is the way I've been thinking about it.
Yeah, that's interesting. And sorry, Ben, I'll go to you in a moment, but just quickly, the architects I was speaking with were saying, we're using AI to spark images and so on. And it means that architects have more time for design and less for the sort of drudgy work of, 100 kind of planning an office with 100 desks and putting in the order to the builder and so on. So that's kind of the optimistic vision for how it'll affect work. But Ben, what were you going to say?
Oh, yeah, I'll just quickly add in as well when you talk about architects. Lawyers are seeing a similar problem. We've now got AIs that claim that they can beat parking tickets and other such things. And I'm not in that space, but I'm sure that's threatening. And we've also got a Gold Coast lawyer who recently was in the news saying that he uses ChatGPT to do his initial cuts of his advice and then edits them down. So it's not just in the art space. I think it's everywhere. But what I did see when I was playing around with some of these tools is there's now also tools that allow you to then edit or change the AI after you get that output, so you can make it fit what you need. So you use that first generation and then you just kind of play with it to make it fit the infrastructure. So maybe we're going to see more tools around the initial output, and artists are going to be working with those tools, and it just changes how you work as opposed to necessarily anything else.
If I can jump in as well, I think you touched on some really interesting points around gig economy and the kinds of works that are being outsourced to AI platforms. feel like the kinds of works that have been historically outsourced to underpaid workers in the global south. And I think it's a really good reflection on the kind of work that is valued in our society. I noted particularly, I think it's ChatGPT had been outsourcing a lot of moderation work to workers in Kenya. And so this is in this kind of like gig economy and globalization of work is all embedded in all of these tools as well. I think there's a really interesting ethical question and reflection of those practices here too.
Just to circle back to my point earlier, Eugenia Lim's work is called On Demand. It's from 2019. And the other work that I would recommend people look up is Kate Crawford's Anatomy of an AI, which deals so well deep diving down into these like really specific ethical dilemmas. So that is an amazing piece of text that kind of deep dives into Amazon's Echo, right down to, you know, where all of the parts of the technology is sourced and the mineral lakes that are getting destroyed from it, and, you know, how much Jeff Bezos is earning in comparison. Like an Amazon miner to make one of these Echoes would have to work for something like 237 years to earn a day of Jeff Bezos's wage. Yeah, it's great. Look it up. It's all on the internet.
Thanks, Xanthe. Yeah, I'm reminded of the new industry that sprung up around design engineering prompts for ChatGPT and other programs, and you see all these YouTube influencers with videos on that, and maybe a new skill for graduates will be actually learning how to communicate with the AI and get it to do what you want it to do. There's another question here from Sophie. Let's go down. There isn't one from Sophie. There's one here though. Do the panels have any advice to help assist young anime artists who have lost their interest and suffer anxiety attacks impacted by the AI to generate art from existing art? So basically, a similar question. Any sort of advice for young artists who just don't know really what they're doing, given that the AI can generate art from existing artworks?
I mean, AI is just another tool. It's just, AI is no more important to me than Word or stickies or this pen. Like, I think that you need to stop giving the AI so much power. Like, it's just another image generation tool, like Google Images is, or we're constantly being given these new technologies. We've got access to virtual reality now. We've got apps that can do augmented reality. Like, you need to approach it as something that is an exciting prosthesis. Like, it's a mode of making and a different way to view or enhance your practice, or just like, don't use it. Who cares? There's always going to be other stuff. Go back and do like traditional animation with flip books. Like, it's just people, it's not a big deal. Chill out, guys.
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you think there's sort of a bit of a mood of kind of panic that's unjustified here? And maybe it's just because really for a lot of people it's only a few months old.
I mean, there's definitely cause to panic, and I can see how AI would be something that people would be projecting a general global panic onto, because it feels tangible and it's new and it's so opaque. Like, we don't really know what is going on behind there. We don't know where this data is coming from. We don't know what's being stolen from us. But, that's been true of all aspects of the internet since the early 1990s when it became available. Like, we all had this utopian vision that the cyber feminists were writing about, and I know that there are a number of them in attendance today. Go off, thank you for coming. This is not a new concern. This is just the newest version of this concern, and because it's become so mainstream, people are giving it heed right now. There's no more than usual cause to be panicking, I suppose.
Do you agree with that, Nina?
Yeah, I think that's a really positive way to look at it. I guess I never had like a visual. I mean, I personally don't panic and I don't freak out about it. I think but I totally understand why you would, and that's really sorry to hear that it's been stressing you out. I think it would just be basically advice would just be to kind of focus on actual physical creative practice that you can work on, become better at. I'm not saying that, prompt engineering isn't a creative practice. Maybe I am saying it's not so much of the same as a creative practice, and it's not going to be as rewarding, I don't think. So the fact that you have a creative practice, you can sit down and draw, or you can, was it anime or animation?
I think it was anime. Yeah.
Anime. Okay. Yeah. So you can kind of like actually, immerse yourself in that kind of creative practice. I think that's great. That's like one of the most valuable things you can have in your life. So try to focus on that as opposed to, I guess, kind of where, how you're necessarily going to make money from this, or is this going to replace you? I think those are a lot of anxieties about the future that maybe aren't so helpful right now.
But also, like, you shouldn't be getting into creative practice to make money. Like, that's a bad choice. This is
it's not going to work out.
This is not a linear industry that has like a surefire success route. Like, if you have talent and you have vision and you have drive, like, sure, it might work out. But like, if you are getting into a creative practice to make money, you have misstepped, my friend.
Yes. How many days of labor would it take to get a Jeff Bezos income? There's another question that might be for Kathryn. I often think about how there's already a lot of appropriation in art that disadvantages artists of color and other marginalized groups, and I can't help but think about the inequalities that can be emphasized by AI. That is, art generation is taking art from people of color artists. I guess I would like to think of how AI would be able to be used to navigate these already existing gaps instead of exacerbating them.
Yes, I think that is such a larger problem and concern about appropriation of the art of people of color and also particularly Indigenous art. I'm hesitant to look to technology as like a techno solutionism, as in like how can we train AI to prevent that kind of appropriation, or like, is there an app for that? There's very rarely an app for that, but rather I think it's much bigger. I think it transcends technology, because there's something inside capitalism and colonialism that produces that kind of appropriation and that kind of disadvantage. I don't think that's something that we can fix via AI as a tool or a medium, but yes, I think it is definitely part of a wider conversation that we should be happening. I know is it Terry Janke, the lawyer, has produced an excellent set of protocols of working with Indigenous artists and kind of cultural protocols in art. I'd like to see that more widely, I guess, like used and established and embedded in all of our practices, and it goes beyond culture and art as well. It's something that we've been able to think about a little bit more in tech too, but yes, I don't think this is the responsibility of technology to fix appropriation, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I mean, because it ultimately comes back to the data set, which itself is a sort of mirror of our biases. And that's an enormous data set that can't just be kind of edited.
Yep.
There's a question here about the nature of creativity, which kind of goes back to the discussion we're having at the beginning. Could you argue that the AI is being creative since it is producing works that have never before been seen? It gathers information from the existing world and works from its surroundings. How is that any different from what humans do as we create art based on our surrounding world? I think, Ben, you might have something to say on this topic.
I think that's a broader question about AI and personhood, right? At what point do we decide that an AI has met whatever criteria we as humans have decided, to recognize that it is capable of doing things that a person can do. Not 100% analogous, but we did recently have the case of an AI creating an invention, and they sought a patent for it. And in the initial first instance, that was the court actually did find that the AI could invent, despite it not being necessarily a human. That's since been overturned. But I think that's kind of the question we're at. When we get to these kinds of questions about, is the AI capable of expressing creative output, it becomes a question of, do we recognize at least elements of personhood in the AI? And I think that's where we get to.
Nina, I think you were sort of observing before that, you know, you don't think AI can be creative. I might have put words in your mouth there, sorry. And I remember when you said that, somebody in the audience said, you know, well, aren't they just sort of finding connections between work that's already out there, which is what humans do all the time. You know, so I suppose it goes to the question of is there something fundamentally creative about a human making artwork, or is can an AI that's just synthesizing artwork that's already out there be creative?
Yeah, well, I guess the analogy would be that the artist just like sits in a room and then looks at like a billion pictures of art that's been created, and then from that just kind of like figures out how to combine a couple of the concepts or whatever. Like I think it's really in that Nick Cave article, he describes it, he kind of goes into it really, that answering that question really well, which is just that the kind of, what is the point of creation and creativity? And, you know, it's not just kind of to have something exist that looks like art, it is to actually express something. It's kind of go through the struggle of creation and to kind of overcome that. And, you know, it really is like a representation of your life. So I think the reason I said that earlier is because until AI or robots or whatever we want to call it have some kind of life experience, then it's hard to imagine that they would be creative in the same way that humans are creative. Yeah.
One for Ben here. Will AI create ownership issues between different people giving similar prompts and getting similar outputs? You know, I suppose essentially you could be creating the same artwork.
So it's really interesting. One of the first things I did when I had a look at this, and I was playing with Night Cafe, they've got like a random seed generator to it as well. But as is the problem with all of these kind of AI tools and ICT solutions, is they're a bit of a black box. You don't really know what the AI does or doesn't take into account. And that kind of impacts on the ability to work out any kind of ownership, because for all you know, typing in your directions to the AI may only be 10% of what the AI actually does. And it puts way more reliance on automated processes and other bits and pieces. And I mean, more to the point though, this random number generating seed thing, in theory, should mean that no two AI are alike, but whether or not that actually happens, I've yet to see two AIs identified, but if anybody can find one, that'd be awesome.
I think you make a good point as well about the uniqueness. We presume that because an AI is involved and an algorithm is involved, that the output is going to be unique every time and for every person. But then I'm sure there are, you know, ears burning when it comes to IP and copyright. If you say, hello, ChatGPT, please like generate the first page of like this book, and you can't take that away and say, okay, this is mine, I made it.
Yeah, I think it's a completely different issue in those text-based services where it is sometimes just taking, or when people are asking it to repeat information or provide information that it's sourced from other places, as opposed to composite an image using various different sources. So I think it's a very different issue, and I think it's one that's tricky to work out. But I imagine if you're taking the first page of a book from somewhere, it's going to be pretty clear that you're taking a book somewhere.
There's a question here from Matt. It's to do with whether AI will have a sort of homogenizing influence on art. I suppose that's kind of looking at it from a very broad perspective. From what I understand, he's saying, you know, if the AI artwork is used to train the AI models, we just sort of end up with this cycle of increasingly banal images, or sort of a lot of artwork looking roughly having a similar aesthetic. Might be one for Nina or Xanthe there.
Well, yeah, I would just say, I think that is like a real concern. Definitely concerns me, not just with art and images, but other kind, like we were talking before, other biases that it's perpetuating. Like I looked a lot into emotion detection, and that's just a whole nother kettle of fish. But yeah, I think it's the homogenizing risk is definitely there, but I guess that's maybe also like two sides of the same coin, is that maybe we'll just have to move away from that kind of format or that kind of medium of art and actually return to the physical world, because that's something that it cannot do, right? So this kind of like image on a screen, maybe that will become completely homogenized. But I mean, I know personally, like, yeah, I don't feel drawn to that medium just because of everything like that that's going on. So I kind of, I don't know, I think I really want to focus on, you know, in real life experiences with communities of people. And that's hopefully maybe everyone will just kind of migrate away from the screen, which I mean, this maybe it's okay, it's probably way too hopeful for me to think this is going to happen. But this is my dream.
To jump in there, I am not concerned really about the homogenization of art. I don't think that that is ever going to happen, because people have been saying that about different things for so long. And now the way that culture moves is so fast, it's much more likely that we will have like a wide sweep, which we've seen in every iteration of AI that's come so far. You know, when DALL-E came out, you know, all we saw for like 4 days was DALL-E produced images, but we move fast, we move in trends. We have Pokemon Go, and that's everybody's obsession for 2 weeks, and then it's dead to us. And that's the way that social media works. And, you know, TikTok will be over within a year and we'll have something else. Like, we're just going much, much faster than we were at other points. But certainly this is reminiscent of conversations that we're having, like, you know, this is art in the age of mechanical reproduction. This is the introduction of the camera. This is video killed the radio star. This is the death of painting. This is the death of the author. Like, everything's still there. I also wanted to clarify on a point that I made earlier, because I saw in the chat. I'm in no way saying that artists should not be paid for their work. I am a unionist. I am absolutely, I too have created my life around attempting to scrapple together bits and pieces of jobs in order to support a creative practice. My point really was that even making art, even being able to choose to make art, is an incredibly privileged position. And so being able to, you know, go and study and be an academic, it requires a level of privilege and access. And part of that is that, you know, there is a risk that it's not going to work out. These are really volatile industries, and, you know, robots and AI are one threat, but, you know, the sort of anti-intellectualism of the institution is another threat, and the constant defunding of art schools is another threat. There are a lot of things. This is not a reliable career trajectory, is my point. But that is in no way to say that I do not think is a valuable choice. Art is a core pillar of society and always has been.
On that point about you know, mechanical reproduction, there's a question from the audience. Nick Cave's response is really interesting to me. Undeniable. Much great art is born out of struggle and existential angst, but there is also a lot of pop art created by humans that is created purely for commercial and entertainment purposes. And, you know, that's true. You see a lot of that on Midjourney if you've ever hung around and then seen what people are making. Is that any less valid? But would anyone like to jump in there? Nina?
Is it less valid? I I mean, there's probably discussion, I mean, some kind of discourse that I haven't really got into that much. Maybe Xanthe probably has a better response to this.
I'll have a go. I think that valid is an issue semantically there to start with. Because if we're talking about art, we're talking about subjectivity, and you know, the value of something is an incredibly institutional or capitalist idea anyway. And this is to raise art in the age of mechanical reproduction again, like these were the concerns of that text. It's very similar to this conversation. The idea that when the camera was introduced, it was suddenly devaluing the painting, that we could then infinitely reproduce this image in any circumstance, and it was no longer held within these, you know, cordoned off gold gilded chapels or wherever, with like specific temperatured rooms or whatever, and suddenly people could access these things on their televisions, and now we see them on our phones. And you know, value is something that is constantly shifting. And I think that we're at an interesting moment in digital practice with things like NFTs are silly, but the blockchain technology is interesting in this regard. And I think that there is going to be something there. Like we're still nutting it out. Like, and this is another area where we could really be seeing a lineage of ownership and artists being paid if we take those digital contracting things in an ethical direction. But I don't know. How do we create value?
Yeah, it reminds me of Nina's point earlier about separating content from art. And I think that's something that I'll definitely be sort of taking away from this discussion, that a tool that can endlessly create, you know, quite fluent writing or visual artworks is amazing at doing content, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's doing art. And maybe the invention of these machines reminds us of that again. There's one more question from the audience, and it's probably going to be our last one. It's just from Benjamin. Curious to hear from the artists if anyone has experimented with or is interested in AI music models. So, you know, remember, I think a couple of weeks ago, Google announced that it had an AI music model where you could input the lyrics and it would pump out the music. It'd be interesting to do that to the Nick Cave style lyrics. Has anyone on the panel used those, you know, early models?
Music's not really my forte, but at the lab we have, I think it's just kind of it's falling a bit behind because it is a lot more complex to do, but there's definitely, I think right now we're still in that like research stage and nothing's really come out public, like commercially, that really like, you know, is as good as GPT or is as good as DALL-E Stable Diffusion. So it's probably coming soon, but it's just not there yet. So it's in that kind of, you know, like how good, basically like Muzak stage. I don't know, yeah, but it's coming probably very soon.
Yeah, I was going to say, my understanding is both video, where AI is being able to do things with video, and music is really not too far away. It's just slightly behind the step, and we won't be long until we can see the ability for companies to completely change the art style in a video or something like that halfway through.
Muzak on tap, it's a horrifying idea.
But is that any different from auto-tune, for example, really, when you start looking at it?
Well, that was my thought when Nick Cave published that thing, is that, you know, a lot of pop music is created by teams of writers and so on, and enormous amounts of production, and a sort of model of one person writing a song was maybe not always what you're hearing on the radio. One more question, just because it's a really good one, and it's one for you, Ben. It's question about, we've kind of touched on it already, but it's asking about copyright, and could you argue that the person who entered the prompt is the owner of the artwork? They're providing their ideas into an external source to create an artwork. The interesting point here is that they mention this parallels to many postmodern artists like Koons or Damien Hirst, who employed external teams to carry out their creative ideas, and they're known as the owner and creator despite not even making the art.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a few bits and pieces to that, right? Is it possible? It's certainly possible for that. It'll all come down to things like independent intellectual effort and whether or not you've shaped or directed it in some way. Probably, that's probably the most likely way you shape it. But on the point of having massive teams and building other things, and even architects to a degree, we normally delineate between various different things, and you own copyright in various different things. For argument's sake, a sculptor and architect, there might be copyright in the plans, there might be copyright in whatever's been produced or built. And with these teams as well, likely there's some sort of contractual framework around that as well, which makes clear that the artist who is commissioning this and building this with their team put all the creative effort in and will own it. And the Copyright Act also does recognize that things built off plans and stuff like that sometimes belong to the artist and other bits. So it's a really complex area, and it will really turn on the relevant facts that kind of apply to that. But in this effort, like if you say house and the AI spits out a really beautiful house, versus if you say I want a house that's red brick on, a thing, and then you reiterate and reiterate and reiterate, you're going to have an easier time arguing one is more independent intellectual effort than the other.
Yeah, right. So it's important to remember that those collections of artists often had sort of contracts that decided who had copyright. We don't necessarily have that here. That's all the time we have. That's all we can get to today. Thank you to the panelists, Xanthe, Ben, Kathryn, Nina. I've learned a couple new words like scrapple. Thanks, Xanthe. And bicurious is another good one. And thank you to the audience for all your amazing questions. There are a wealth of opinions and questions in the chat, so thank you. And over to you, Sophie.
Thank you so much for everybody that came today and to our amazing panelists. This talk will be uploaded online early next week for people to watch on demand, and we will also be producing a short article outlining some of the points said today, though that will be very difficult because it went a lot of places. Hopefully our AI transcription can help us find some common themes. As always, we really appreciate the time and care that everybody takes, especially in this very active comment section. And we look forward to seeing you all soon for another digital skills panel. Have a lovely afternoon, and as always, get in touch if you have any questions.